The cold darkness of deep space enveloped the vessel, vigilant, leaving nothing but the soft hum of life support systems and the muted thrum of distant engines. It was the kind of quiet that gnawed at the nerves, the silence beyond silence that weighed heavily on the minds of men who dared venture this far from the safety of Earth. The crew was sparse, just 4 souls on board, hardened by years of expeditions into the unknown. Cale, the navigator, leaned back in his seat, flicking a glance at the slowly star map. Beside him, Rook, the communications officer, fiddled with the console, tracing static readings that were as uneventful as any day in the deep dark. But then the scream came. It wasn't a crackling glitch or a simple data anomaly. It was a human voice, agonizing, endless, the unmistakable howl of raw torment. Cale's heart skipped, and his eyes darted to Rook, whose hand froze above the console. "Did you hear that?" Rook's voice was a near whisper, his face drained of color. Cale nodded, a chill sliding down his spine. "That wasn't the system, right? Tell me that wasn't just a glitch." "No," Rook swallowed hard, his fingers trembling over the controls as he adjusted frequencies. "No, it's not a glitch. It's a broadcast." The sound came again, longer this time, as if the voice had lungs deep as oceans, as if pain had become a language of its own. The rest of the crew arrived within seconds, drawn by the dreadful sound. Commander Tev and Elias, the engineer, entered the small control room, both with matching frowns. "What's going on?" Tev demanded, his voice carrying the authority that kept fear at bay. Rook tapped at his screen, isolating the signal. "It's coming from nearby. We're receiving it from an object. A satellite, I think. Coordinates are right here." He jabbed at the map, and the others leaned in, frowning at the source. "A satellite?" Elias muttered, incredulous. "Out here? Who the hell would put a satellite this far out?" Commander Teva strains to glance with Cale, his eyes narrowing. "Can we get a visual?" Cale worked quickly, tapping commands into the console until the ship's external cameras focused in on the distant object. The image flickered to life, showing a dark, rusted shape drifting slowly through space. It was covered in what looked like vines of metal, twisted and knotted, with strange protrusions like spines jutting out at odd angles. The image shifted to pictures of the fleet entering the Kang units. He let out a moan from the distemper, but still cautiously moved his head further. "That's no standard satellite," Tev murmured. Cale squinted at the feed. There was something unnatural about the structure, its shape too erratic, too chaotic. The screams were louder now, pouring out of the speakers with a gut-wrenching clarity that sent Elias staggering back, his face a mask of shock. "We need to find out what it is," Tev decided, his voice firm despite the unease rippling through the crew. "Prep the suits. We're going over there." The void was a silent predator, pressing down on their suit shields as they drifted towards the satellite. Cale felt sweat pooling at the base of his spine, his fingers tight around his tether line. The satellite loomed closer, its twisted frame casting strange shadows across the stars. "This place is a relic," Elias said, his voice trembling slightly through the comms. "It looks old." "Like a tomb," Cale muttered, instantly regretting the choice of words. They landed on the surface with a muted clunk, their boots magnetically locking onto the metal. The structure groaned beneath them, a low, almost living sound that vibrated through their bones. Cale's gaze scanned the surface, noticing symbols carved into the metal, intricate patterns that resembled eyes and mouths, frozen in silent screams. "You guys seeing this?" Rook called out, his helmet light illuminating more of the twisted carvings. "These markings, they're almost like warnings." Cale moved ahead, feeling the dread deepen as he approached what seemed to be an airlock. The screams, impossibly, were louder here, reverberating through the metal in an unending cycle of anguish. "Commander," Cale began, his voice barely steady, "I'm not sure this is a good idea." Tev joined him, placing a gloved hand on the ancient console beside the airlock. "We're here to investigate, not speculate." He hesitated for only a second, before pressing a series of buttons. The airlock shuddered, then slowly ground open, a puff of stale air escaping from within. It carried with it a smell that even their suits couldn't quite filter out, the rank, metallic scent of decay. "Move in," Tev ordered, though his voice lacked its usual ironclad certainty. Inside, the satellite was a labyrinth. The narrow corridors twisted and turned in impossible angles, the walls etched with more of those screaming symbols. Kale led the way, his headlamp piercing the dark, revealing walls covered in something organic, tendril-like growths that seemed to pulse under the light. What is this place?" Elias whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out, his fingers brushing the growth. It recoiled at his touch, and for a split second, Kale swore he saw something behind it, a flash of teeth, a glint of eyes. The screams grew louder, echoing from deeper within the satellite. They were joined by other sounds now, scratching, a rhythmic thumping, and beneath it all a deep, resonant growl. "Commander, this thing, it's alive," Kale said, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Tev glanced back at the rest of the crew. Elias was breathing heavily, his eyes darting at every shadow, while Rook clutched his scanner like a lifeline, his hands trembling. "We keep moving," Tev said, though there was fear in his eyes now, a flicker of doubt. "We need to reach the source of this signal." They pressed on, the air growing thick with an unseen presence. It was as if they were being watched from every angle, their movements tracked by unseen eyes. The passageway opened into a large chamber, and Kale's breath caught in his throat. Suspended in the center of the room was a figure, a man, or what remained of one. His body was twisted, stretched out as if pulled by invisible hands. His mouth was opened in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. 10 drills wrapped around his limbs, burrowed into his flesh, keeping him in place. "Oh," Rook whispered, stumbling back. That's where the screams are coming from." Kale's stomach churned as he realized Rook was right. The man's mouth moved, though there were no lungs left to push the sound. It was the tendrils, vibrating against his vocal cords, producing that endless, inhuman wail. "We need to get out of here," Elias said, panic edging his voice. Before Tev could respond, the chamber shuddered, the walls rippling like the surface of water. The symbols began to glow, their carved mouths opening wider, the eyes seeming to follow each crew member. And then the screaming changed. It wasn't just the man anymore. It was other voices, familiar voices. Kale's own voice echoed through the chamber, a cry of agony. He spun, his headlamp flashing across the walls, and saw his own face carved into the metal, his mouth open in a scream. "No, no, no," he muttered, backing away. The others' faces were there too, etched into the walls, their eyes wide with terror. "It's us," Brooke gasped. It's mimicking us." Suddenly, the chamber erupted in movement, the tendrils detached from the man, slithering across the floor toward the crew. Kale felt something wrap around his ankle, pulling him down. He kicked out, his boot connecting with something solid, and the tendril recoiled with a hiss. "Fall back," Teb shouted, his voice breaking. "Get to the airlock, now!" They ran, the walls shifting around them, the corridors no longer where they had been. Kale's heart pounded in his chest, the screams filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. He could hear Elias behind him, his breath ragged, and then a sudden, choked cry. Kale glanced back, his heart dropping as he saw Elias pulled into the darkness, the tendrils wrapping around his helmet, crushing it with a sickening crack. Blood splattered across the walls, and Kale forced himself to look away, tears blurring his vision. "Keep moving," Tev roared, his voice barely audible over the din. The airlock was just ahead, the dim light of the Vigilant visible through the small window. Brooke reached it first, slamming his hand against the control panel. The door hissed open and Kale and Tev stumbled through, gasping for breath. "Where's Lewis?" Rook asked, though the look in his eyes said he already knew. Tev shook his head, his face pale. "We need to detach now." Kale worked quickly, sealing the airlock and cutting the tether lines. The Vigilant pulled away from the satellite, the screams fading into the distance, though Kale could still hear them in his mind, echoing in the silence. "The thing, it was a prison," Rook said, his voice hollow. "Those symbols, the carvings, they were warnings." Tev nodded, his eyes distant. "A prison. For something ancient, something that feeds on fear, on pain." He looked at Kale, his expression grim. "And now it has Elias." Kale closed his eyes, the image of Elias's face etched into the metal flashing in his mind. The satellite drifted away, its twisted form swallowed by the darkness, the screams finally fading into silence. But Kale knew they would never truly leave him. The sound of his own voice, twisted in agony, would haunt him for the rest of his days, a reminder of the horrors that lurked in the endless void, waiting for those foolish enough to listen. Days passed, and the Vigilant drifted through the cold, empty black. The crew was reduced to 3, the weight of what they had seen hanging heavy in the silence. Kale barely slept. Each time he closed his eyes, the screams echoed through his mind, louder, closer, as if they were no longer confined to that distant satellite. One night, as the ship floated through the endless night, Kale awoke to a sound that turned his blood to ice. A scream. Not just any scream, but Elias's voice, raw with terror. It came from the comms panel, a broken, static-filled cry that rose and fell, cutting through the stillness. Kale stumbled out of his bunk, his heart pounding in his ears. He rushed to the control room, where Tev and Rook were already standing, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. "It's him," Rook whispered, his eyes glistening with tears. He's still out there." Kale shook his head, his hands trembling. No, it's a thing. It's using his voice." Tev looked at the console, his jaw clenched. His screams continued, growing louder, filling every corner of the ship. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, as if the vessel itself was beginning to share in the torment. "We need to shut it out," Tev said, his voice wavering. "Cut the comms, cut everything. We can't let it in." Kale nodded, moving to the console, his fingers hovering over the controls. But as he reached for the switch, the lights flickered, and the ship shuddered, a deep groan reverberating through the hall. "What's happening?" Rook shouted, panic rising in his voice. The screams grew louder, deafening now, as if they were coming from within the ship. Kale's fingers moved faster, cutting power to the comms, but the screams didn't stop. They seemed to echo from the walls, the floor, the very air they breathed. Tev grabbed Kale's shoulder, his face twisted in terror. "It's here. It's inside the ship." Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging them into darkness. Kale's breath came in ragged gasps, the screams now surrounding them, filling the void, pressing against his mind until he thought he would break. Then, silence. The lights flickered back on, dim and shaky, casting long shadows across the control room. Kale looked around, his heart pounding, his eyes wide with fear. Tev was standing beside him, his face pale, his eyes staring ahead, unfocused. "Tev?" Kale whispered, reaching out to touch his arm. Tev slowly turned his head, his eyes locking onto Kale's. There was something wrong in them, something empty, something cold. He opened his mouth, and Kale's blood ran cold as a familiar scream erupted from his throat. Elias's scream, twisted and broken. Kale stumbled back, his hands trembling, his mind reeling. The thing had taken Tev, just as it had taken Elias. It was here, inside the ship, and there was no escaping it. Rook was gone. Cale didn't know when, didn't know how. He was alone now, the ship creaking around him, the darkness pressing in. The screams echoed through the corridors, a chorus of agony, a reminder that there was no escape. He sank to the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes staring into the dim light. The symbols carved into the satellite flashed through his mind, their mouths open, in silent screams, their eyes watching, always watching. The screams would never stop. They were a part of him now, a part of the ship, a part of the void. And as Cale closed his eyes, the darkness swallowing him whole, he knew that he would join them soon. His voice added to the endless, echoing torment of the deep. A prison without walls, without end.